International humanitarian law has to deal with one of the most terrible problems humans can face, with one of the most complex mechanisms in which the species can plunge: atrocity. It is an attempt that has been undertaken with integrity to humanize societies and conflicts, so that the idea of the Stoics can be followed. When it seems that nothing makes sense, even if the purpose of life isn't clear, it's indispensable and inescapable to reduce cruelty. International humanitarian law tries to develop the idea of the Stoics to reduce atrocity, fundamentally distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. Many times wars cannot be avoided. There are wars that come from fear and terror, and others that are the struggle for justice of the people, that come deep from their sense of dignity and justice. But in any case, cruelty is something that must be tried to be reduced. This leads to think of a way to protect mainly non-combatants, the civilian population, because the type of wars that have developed over the last few years tend to involve the civilian population more and more, which makes them targets of disproportionate power, against which those who are caught in the middle of a conflict cannot be defended. But the non-combatant isn't only the one who isn't involved, but also the one who may be injured at some point in the conflict. The idea comes from a battle in Italy, in Solferino, Lombardy, south of Lake Garda. It was on June 24, 1859, when the armies of France and Sardinia fought against the forces of the Emperor of Austria. The results of the battle were described as the most terrible slaughter that has been seen then. At sunset, a Swiss man who was 30 years old at that time appeared, a man called Henry Dunant. When he saw the battlefield, he was shocked, impressed by the near 9,000 wounded men from both sides, exposed to die in the utmost helplessness. Dunant, with the limited resources at that time, slipped through pools of blood, the legions of flies, the heralds of death, and while passing through on top of the shattered bodies, he tried to help them, while they yelled at him, "Lord, we have fought bravely, and now we are abandoned." Dunant could not stand the nightmare of Solferino's horror, and it made him write a text, a desperate call to make a plea to men in all countries, and from all social classes. Since wars cannot always be avoided, isn't it urgent to insist that efforts are made to prevent them? Or at least soften his horrors, he wrote. This is the beginning of international humanitarian law, and how the legal and political mechanisms have faculties to carry out its efforts to reduce cruelty caused by war. Then we can understand how the set of norms is defined and why for humanitarian reasons it seeks to limit the effects of armed conflicts through the protection of people who don't participate or no longer participate in hostilities and civilian property, as well as the limitations of means and methods of combat. Continuing with the story, at that time 4 Swiss citizens decided to meet: General Guillaume Henri thir, Attorney Gustave Moynier, Dr. Louis Appia, Dr. Theodore Manwar, and partnered with Dunant to work for a humanitarian proposal. And on February 17, 1863, they formed the International Relief Committee, called the Committee of the Five, that aimed to gather in Geneva an international conference of experts from 16 countries to lay the foundations of a humanitarian movement that promised to provide assistance to all war wounded with a neutral voluntary service. The committee achieved recognition, and the conference took place in Geneva in 1864. The agreement was signed, and that instrument began to be codified as the principle of international humanitarian law. The agreement had the symbol of the Red Cross on a white background. That is the origin of the Red Cross. The Committee of the Five became the International Committee of the Red Cross, an international organism so that in the whole world the civil and military victims can be protected during the armed conflicts of the direct consequences. That is the fundamental origin of the international humanitarian law and of the Red Cross. In the Islamic countries it is called the Red Crescent Movement because they are not people of the cross, but of the crescent moon. However, they are both neutral organisms that help victims on the battlefields. To violate the neutrality of the Red Cross is an attack on international humanitarian law, interrupting ambulances, taking out the injured, hindering the provision of services in any way, is an attack against the organizations that are trying to implement it in times of despair. There are many examples in history on attempts to reduce the atrocity of war, such as Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War, which was the first woman who was directly helping wounded soldiers in an English hospital, or that time that 4 Catholic evangelist missionaries prevented the killing of 400,000 Chinese at the hands of the Japanese army during the invasion. In Nanjing, the Japanese army killed 400,000 people, and when they were going to kill the other 400,000, these missionaries declared a sign of neutrality so they couldn't enter, put on their chest as a shield, and courageously enforced international mediations to save a large number of the population from a campaign of annihilation. Everything has been an attempt to avoid suffering and reduce cruelty. In extreme moments, international humanitarian law has 2 pillars. The first is the Geneva Convention, where it was made known and institutionalized. And the other is the International Court of Justice. Both are based on a fundamental principle, that wars, for terrible and serious they might be, must respect certain rules. In the 20th century, this was complicated with the scheme of World War II, when lighting war was declared by the Germans. The purpose wasn't to defeat the other army in confrontation, like in First World War, which was a horror, but was a horror among armies. In the Second World War, the scheme of lighting war led to civilian population to become the target. In the First World War, it was 13% of the civilian population that was affected. In the Second World War, it was 70%, and in the rest of wars that have happened after the World War, there are 90% of the civilian population trapped in the conflict. What happened with World War II is that the goal was to end the enemy lines, to isolate them from supplies. Then, all the bridges, the light fences, the electrical interconnection, and the infrastructure, and eventually the civilians, who were the ones who provided food, became targets. Then everything became a military objective. And when everything became a military target, it became a war of absolute destruction. The destruction of all the infrastructure of cities, water, villages, and people. It became a dimension of atrocity, a true collapse of reason. The Nuremberg trials created an ethical reference. It was established that there are things that cannot be done, that makes no sense and injures all mankind. This began to be known as war crimes and crimes against humanity. One of the reasons why Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, was prosecuted at that time was because during the period between wars, he developed a diplomatic scheme that led the world to war. So this type of action began to be regulated in order to be judged. That can happen again, and there are going to be courts in charge of judging the individuals that incur in this type of flagrant violations, that attempt against human mankind. No one will be able to hide an excuse under the fact that they obey orders, because the one who executes them is personally responsible for the consequences of their acts as much as the one who gives them. And the proof of that was a German officer who had the order to destroy and blew up Paris. But the man said, "I won't go in history as the man who blew up Paris." So he disorganized the ammunition, the detonators, the soldiers, and warned the Allies that they had to arrive immediately. He didn't obey the order to destroy Paris, so no one can be obeying something that injures his own dignity. This is already judged in the courts, and the whole process of International Court of Justice is to typify and regulate these type of crimes. The idea is that there are no conflicts, but if they can't be avoided, at least if there is the possibility of reducing cruelty, we must try it. The Geneva Protocols are much more specific about how to regulate international humanitarian law. The first Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the wounded and sick in the armed forces and field, and the second Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the condition of wounded, sick and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea are similar, covering land and sea respectively. They embody the main idea which led to the founding of the Red Cross. If a member of the armed forces is wounded or sick and therefore in no condition to take an active part in the hostilities, he is no longer part of the fighting force and becomes a vulnerable person in need of protection and care. The third Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war covers members of the armed forces who fall into enemy hands. They are in the power of the enemy state, not of the individuals or troops who have captured them. The fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war covers all individuals who do not belong to the armed forces, take no part in the hostilities and find themselves in the hands of the enemy or an occupying power. In conclusion, even during conflicts and war, there has to be certain rules, and this idea is very old. During the time of the samurai in Japanese culture, the bushido was a norm of ethical behavior of the warrior, and was a norm that made the samurai warrior respect the lives of the helpless, the widows, and the orphans. You can watch my video The 7 Principles of Bushido at my channel. The medieval knights also had an ethical obligation to protect non-combatants and to face each other in conditions of equality with another warrior, who could defend himself as much as he. From the increasing cruelty and atrocities due to the Second World War, a counterweight emerged to make an effort to reduce this as much as possible, to understand the origins of international humanitarian law and the evolution of its mechanisms, how they have acted in armed conflicts, allows us to raise awareness and perhaps contribute our own actions to reduce the suffering of other human beings.